I would like to start with an extract from the Edinburgh-based periodical The Lounger, literary publication, and readers on the 28th of May, 1785, discovered an article signed by an individual called John Homespun, actually the pen name for a more famous Scottish playwright, poet, and novelist. Henry Mackenzie is mostly remembered for a sentimental novel, The Man of Filling. And in this extract, Homespun reflects on the disruption brought by the return of East India Company officers to their native country while engaging with material culture and new consumption habits. So about that time, my neighbor Mushroom's son, who'd been sent out to India about a dozen years ago, returned home with a fortune, as we are told, of £100,000 and has taken up his residence at his father's till some finer place shall be found out for him. This fictional piece is quite reminiscent of contemporary caricatures of Nabobs, a corruption of the Persian Nawabs, a governor of the Mughal Empire, and hence the name used at the time to refer to these wealthy returnees who came back to India. And you will note the use of a mushroom, like that's a reference to these quick fortunes, blossoming, as quickly as mushrooms after the rain. It was also largely inspired by Mackenzie's compatriots and friends who were themselves returnees. So later on, the discourse, draws upon racial discourses and to convey the fear of the intrusion of Oriental despotism. So that's the episode in the church, during which you've got the pew all carpeted and cushioned over for the reception. These were flowered muslins and gold muslins, white shawls and red shawls, etc., etc. At the end, Mackenzie concluded by expressing feelings of exclusion, as if the East India Company's nouveau riche were now replacing the traditional English gentry. And here I quote, "I am really afraid that I must sell my little estate and leave this part of the country altogether, that I must try to find out some new place of residence where nabobs, rajas, lakhs of rupees were never heard of, and where people know no more of Bengal than of the man in the moon." So according to Mackenzie's satire, East India Company fortunes profoundly disrupted Britain's society, a fact that has been largely acknowledged in recent scholarship. However, and this is it's precisely what I would like to do today, is to move away from Bengal, which was under direct East India Company administration, and focus on people who were reestablishing themselves through estate and house purchases, and I would like actually to engage directly with what is actually the lesser-known impact, but culturally significant independent kingdoms. So people who were intermediaries of empire, while working for the East India Company, they were simultaneously involved in diplomatic and all forms of diplomacy and other stuff. And that is another objective, is to also to go beyond national bonded narratives, building quite a sort of neat and simplistic opposition. And here is, probably the most obvious example of that. It's an opposition between the homebred Englishman and his little estate versus extravagant Orientalist display of wealth. And you will note that in that case, the corruption comes from India, but not from the Atlantic. Is it because Henry Mackenzie's own family, based in Bristol, was involved in West Indian trade? Well, but actually, that's an open question. So, in doing so, my paper is very much, a response to the East India Company at Home project and a remark by Margot Finn and Kate Smith, according to which company history has been written from, I quote, the twofold perspective of London and Calcutta. And Finn and Smith stress the importance to engage with the provincial hinterlands that provided distinctive context for engagement in imperial domesticity and self-fashioning. So that, really much inspired my choice of examples for today. I will be focusing on two independent kingdoms of Awadh who actually emerged as actually more independent after the collapse of the Mughal Empire, the Battle of Plassey, so that is probably a bit more well known. The Azaf-ud-Dawla, Nabob of Awadh, that's a frontier zone in the north of India, is quite well known to historians of the British Empire in India, especially since he hired people like Colonel Polier, so a lot of European intermediaries, also Scots and British intermediaries. But I also would like to draw your attention to a man, Muhammad Ali Khan, who was Nabob of Arcot in the Carnatic being a very important strategy in terms of military strategy at the time because of its proximity, of Madras, the headquarters of the East India Company, the presidency, the Madras presidency. So I will therefore focus on 3 intermediaries of empire today, the Englishman Paul Benfield and 2 Scots. The first one, Kenneth Murchison of Taradale, is a native of Rothshire. He was a surgeon, an East India Company surgeon, and Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie, who was a diplomat, a Persian translator, interpreter, and he worked in the East India Company. So, I mean, the motivation for choosing this, vast range of 2-3 different houses and different stories of re-establishment. It's also a way to engage with the proto-familial state that's been defined by Margot Finn. So basically a system of promotion relying on interpersonal, kin-based relations rather than a more impersonal, bureaucratic, basically what we know as the Raj later. And here we're talking about something that is more decentralized in nature. Most recently, Andrew MacKillop has also applied the concept of the proto-familial state to Scottish imperial families and their global strategies. And they'll be using the clan system as a way to go beyond the family-centered narrative and trying to think more about how a clan, which in terms of Scottish history is basically obsolete by the time, how actually it transposed in the colonial context and how it just acquired a new meaning, something which actually encompasses family but goes far beyond. So my first example is Hoodfall Park, an estate connecting the successor state of Arcot in southeast India to Hertfordshire in England. Woodwall Park was built for Sir Thomas Rumbold, East India director from 1772 to 1777. He was also governor of Madras. I'll come back to this. His rise of fortune in India is very much connected to Robert Clive of India. We've already had Boris Castle mentioned. Robert Clive is mostly famous for the granting of the Diwani, so taxation rights, from the Mughal emperor to the East India Company. So Rumbold's very much, started his career in the shadow of famous or infamous Clive, to such an extent that he was criticized for undermining company's authority and fulfilling his own agenda by acting as an intermediary with the state of Arcot. So his governorship of Madras was interpreted as a clear sign of the Nawab's ability to use his supporters to neutralize the acting governor in 1775, John Pigott. And the reason why I'm mentioning George Pigott is because Pigott also used his East India Company fortune and the salary coming directly from the Nabob of Arcot to build Patsall Estate in Stratfordshire, and the gardens were designed by the famous Capability Brown. So to come back to the Nabob of Arcot and the Madras governorship. So what happened is that, to make a long story short, but basically in 1775, the acting governor of Madras, George Pigott, wasn't the favorite of the Nabob of Arcot because he wanted to restore the lands of his rival, the Raja of Travancore, and that infuriated the Nabob of Arcot, who used his local agents. We need to think about creditors. We have quite a complex system of debts here, and what they did is just kidnapped the governor of Madras. He died in captivity in 1707, and he was replaced with Rumbold, which previously served as the Nabob of Arcot's own agent and lobbyist. So the point I want to make here is that we need to think of these places are not just the product of East India Company, patronage or the administrative machine, but we need to think about the direct, intrusion of the Nabob of Arcot, in localized places. Okay, so a place like Arcot, which we think is quite regional on the periphery, is assuming quite a central role in England. So, I mean, to show you a little bit more about Woodwall Park today, I mean, it's completed in 1707, designed by the English architect Thomas Leverton. I don't have time to talk about Leverton, but he's a fascinating character. He designed sugar refineries in London and New York, so a lot of interesting, West Indian connections here. The most famous room is the print room in Woodwall Park. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any reference to the Mongols or to Indian culture or whatever, nothing. I mean, the question that may be asked, it's hardly a new one, is that the ostensibly orientalized style that we can have in the example of Sir Charles Cockerell, Sissingcott House, for example, seems to be more of an exception rather than the rule. There are some reasons why these people were not trying to make an obvious reference to the Nabob of Arcot, for example, or just India in general. But, I mean, it's obviously quite a paradox when you think that they were celebrating their imperial success with an extravagant building like this, and at the same time they were quite it was a way to domesticate and conceal the origin of the money. So the next owner of Woodwall Park, so that extracts from the new Vitruvius Britannicus, so showing that, you know, Leverton and Rumbold wanted the people to know about how important the building is. Still a very impressive building to this day. The next owner is a man called Paul Benfield, and guess what? He was also a creditor of the Nabob of Arcot. So I didn't manage to find any evidence of the same house being in ownership of two people who were involved in, you know, in sort of micro, you know, regional conflict in India. But I think it's quite interesting. Paul Benfield is today probably the man we associate with, like, the epitome of the English Nabob. He amassed a considerable fortune. He was the Nawab's financial advisor. He was also his creditor. Interestingly, these guys had their fingers in many pies. He was also involved in Jamaica. We have his name, you know, in the compensation records, part of the Benfield estates. So very much a jack of all trades, if you like. The final thing I would like to say is, in this satirical depiction of Benfield, what I think is partly interesting is the correlation of a typical 18th century improved landscape. What looks like in the background more like Woodwall Park, probably, but also the fact that Benfield's dark complexion suggests, you know, a direct relation between his financial dealings and his supposed corruption by the Oriental despotism of the Nawab. But the Nawab isn't mentioned here. So let's move to my second example, which is Newton Castle in Blairgowrie in Scotland. So I'm moving north. I did the opposite journey today, actually, coming from Scotland. So what is probably interesting in the case of Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie is that he is a man who returned from India in 1787. He's previously served in the military as Quartermaster General in Bengal. He also commanded battalions of sepoys, and that's in the 14th battalion, with the 14th battalion, that he conducted operations between 1707 and 1780. But the reason why I mentioned him and included him in my presentation is that he was involved in a form of soft diplomacy with the Nawab of Awad and also the Nawab of Arcot, both at the same time, through a Scottish clan network or a neo-clanship network. So what is particularly interesting in the case of Blairgowrie Castle, it shows how East India Company fortunes were both subverting Highland identity. He is someone from the Highlands, but interestingly, he's not reestablishing himself in the Highlands for financial reasons. He's been sort of evicted by more successful members of his clan, so I think that's something quite interesting. On the other hand, today, that is considered as the stronghold, if you prefer, of the Macpherson clan. So when I visited Newton Castle, here's a picture. So that's Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie. And here is Sir William Macpherson of Cluny. Actually, what is very interesting is that now it's considered as a Macpherson place, but this is not in the Macpherson territory, if you prefer. So in terms of national identities, I think there's actually a lot to think about. I would like to stress some interesting, I would say, more recent considerations. The Macphersons of Blairgowrie were involved both west, so Atlantic. Alan Macpherson of Blairgowrie, who returned from India, had 2 sons in Berbice and in Jamaica. They came back to Newton House with mixed-race children. We have letters and the correspondence. We know that they have been completely isolated, so they were not really living on the Newton estate. But what is interesting is that in 1993, Sir William Macpherson of Cluny was investigating the murder of Mr. Stephen Lawrence, who was a teenager who was killed by a gang of white men in London, and the report has been very much a landmark in addressing issues of, the legacies of colonial violence and racial prejudices. So I think it's interesting to see this sort of long-term perspectives here. And Sir William was encouraging scholars to actually engage with India and Jamaica. So actually, as to finish with, I would like to say something about Taradale House. So we're moving north again, properly Highlands, with the man you can see here, a lovely portrait by Henry Reburn. Kenneth Murchison is probably mostly remembered today as the father of Roderick Murchison, founder of the Chair of Geology in Edinburgh. There is a building called the Murchison House, I think. What is interesting is here it's a different kind of profile. It's a man who is reestablishing himself in Taradale. He's buying the estate through East India Company money, but also through his private practice of medicine in Awadh. So both for the army of the Nabob, but also for the Nabob himself. And he's reestablishing himself in a territory, in the Mackenzie, if you prefer, territory, buying the estate from his uncles. So we've got different, when we think about family strategies, we usually quite emphasizes, sort of continuity between the legacy, but you also have some contrasting and sometimes competing interest within the family, and I think that is quite obvious in his example. So the house doesn't, sadly, looks very different from what it used to be. So there's some lovely maps. What I wanted to show is Taradale House today. It's quite different. But like Alan Macpherson in Blairgowrie, we know that Kenneth Murchison had a collection of artifacts, of manuscripts, of Indian manuscripts. So I'm currently trying to see where they might have ended up. What needs to be mentioned is the question of the legacy of these places. Woodwall Park, Benfield, Rumbold, it's now a school. I double-checked on the website. There's no mention of empire at all in the house that actually built for a Nabob. In Taradale House, it's a bit different. It was used by the University of Aberdeen for quite a long time for field trip and mostly by archaeologists and the Department of Geography. But they never really addressed not only the East India Company, connection, but also the connection to the successor states of the Mughal Empire. So just to finish with two very, very short remarks. The first one is, I'm actually wondering whether we can actually use the neo-clanship or the clanship as a way to broaden the horizons and going a little bit beyond family histories. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize clanship. We've got a lot of rivalries within the clanship networks, but I think it's something important. And the second one is, I think in these three examples, I think it's a great way to think about how places which are considered on the periphery, either in Scotland or in India, were able for a short period, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, interestingly at the time of the impeachment of Warren Hastings, how these people were managed to force changes right at the center of power. We are talking about big players, Rumbold, Benfield, etc. Benfield is a bit more on the periphery, but Rumbold, Governor of Madras, is clearly a very important player. So yeah, I mean, it's probably a way to problematize, I mean, our approach of the country houses. And something that has been done recently is mostly focusing, especially in Scottish history, a lot on estates and improvements and what's the legacy on the estates, but what's inside the house. These houses were not seen the same way by someone like Benfield, someone like Rumbold, and Taradell House, which, as far as I know, was a bit more of a boring, place inside. It means that the preoccupations were quite different. How do you re-indigenize, how do you normalize your external capital? I think that's the big question. Thanks very much.